Hey everyone! This week we're exploring sex, gender, and sexuality, which corresponds with your chapter 11 in your ebook. So, to get us started with this week's theme and topic, we're going to do a little social experiment. The next slide will illustrate two individuals. One person will be on the left, one person will be on the right, and your job in the next slide is to identify who is male and who is female. So, I'll flash them very briefly, and you'll have a few seconds to try to decide which one you think is male and which one is female. So, what did you see? Which one was male and which one was female? And don't cheat, don't pause the video and go back to try to see what you saw. But the question is, of course, what did you see and how did you know what you saw? And what were you looking for when you tried to figure out which individual was male and which individual was female? So this is actually what you saw. This experiment is intended to illustrate that when we are trying to figure out one's sex or gender, we rarely look at their genitalia. So my guess is that you probably thought the person on your left is female and the person on your right is male. And you probably weren't looking at the fact that the person on the left has a penis and the person on the right has a vagina. Rather, we typically use other physical markers to figure out what someone's sex or gender identity is. We look at things like breasts or hair length or chest hair or facial shape. And so this leads us to our next question, which is, what's the difference between sex and gender? What is sex? What is gender? These terms are often used interchangeably. And so we're going to distinguish the difference a little bit. So to get started, we're going to talk about sex. And sex refers to biology or anatomy. So this is these physical differences between males and females. And social scientists like to differentiate between one's primary sex characteristics and their secondary sex characteristics. So primary sex characteristics refer to the body parts that you need to specifically reproduce. So if you have a pencil and a paper in here, you might want to just jot down primary sex characteristics refer to reproductive parts. So if you think, well, what do men need to reproduce? They need testicles and penis, and females need a uterus and vagina, their ovaries, etc., etc. On the other hand, we have what we call the secondary sex characteristics, and these are anatomical differences between men and women that are not necessarily needed to reproduce. One of the key markers a lot of students point out is the Adam's apple. Men typically have Adam's apples while women do not, and we use that to distinguish between men and women, but we also don't need them to reproduce. If you can just maybe write down a few other secondary sex characteristics, just brainstorm a few that would be helpful. You can probably think of things like the breasts or hip shape or facial hair, body shape, etc., etc. Oftentimes people ask how many sexes there are, and most people assume there's just two sexes, male versus female. But what a lot of people often do is neglect the fact that we actually have a small intersex population. Less than 1% of our population is intersex, which means that they're born with ambiguous genitalia and ambiguous hormonal makeup that make them not fully female and not fully male. Historically, they were referred to as hermaphrodites, but that term has since become considered offensive, and so we actually use the term intersex. The intersex community actually experienced a lot of discrimination from the medical industry for the vast majority of history in the United States, where they would decide what sex to turn the newborn baby into based on the size of the clitoris or penis. And essentially they took a ruler, measured the sex organ, and if it was a certain size, it would be assumed that this child should be male, and they would try to convert the child into a male by hormone therapy. And if it didn't reach that marker, they would try to turn the newborn baby into a female by reducing the size of the sex organ to try to make it look physically like a clitoris, And oftentimes they would do things like vaginoplasties and then use hormone therapy to help turn this child into a female. In the 1990s, there was actually a big intersex movement where activists in the intersex community really felt that this was an invasion of their personal human rights. And so they advocated for the medical industry to stop performing these unnecessary surgeries. And since then, there has been a lot more conversation about the rights of intersex individuals and their ability to decide whether they want to be male, female, or neither. Um, and as such, we're seeing a lot more intersex individuals coming out. What's really fascinating about some individuals who are intersexed is that they often spend their whole lives not knowing they're intersexed, because while on the outside they may have what appears to be quote unquote normal penis and testicles, on the inside they might actually have female reproductive parts and vice versa. So the intersex community in the US is a growing field of research, and it's actually really interesting to see the new research that comes out among them. So that's sex. Sex is tied up with all of our biology and anatomy, but we often use the term gender interchangeably with sex. But what is gender? So gender is not necessarily directly tied to our biology, although there is a link. So gender often refers to the feelings that we have of who we are. So our identity is part of gender. Gender also refers to our behavior, so the actions that we take, whether it be the way we inflect our voices, or the way we carry ourselves, or the way we dress, or whether or not we wear makeup or not. And the other big aspect of gender is what society expects of you. So my guess is that if you grew up in a family with siblings of the opposite sex, you were probably treated really differently. Perhaps you had a different curfew time, or you were given more or less freedoms, or you were expected to do certain chores around the house based on your gender. And this refers to these outside expectations of what our society deems to be quote unquote masculine or feminine. Something to really remember about gender is that it is a social construction, meaning that gender changes over time and gender also changes across cultures. So in the US, if you think about 2020, our understandings of gender has exploded. In contrast to perhaps the 1950s, where there were way more rigid expectations for women and men. And if you actually go to different cultures, you see a lot of cultural differences in what's acceptable and what isn't. So a great example of this is Margaret Mead's research, and she was an anthropologist that studied gender behavior across 3 New Guinea tribes. And she traveled around the world and was really interested in gender relations in different tribal communities. And what she found is that in the comparison of these 3 specific tribes in Papua New Guinea, the gender roles were vastly different, even though they were in a similar geographical territory. So in one of the tribes, the men were actually considered the peaceful ones, and they stayed at home and took care of the babies, spent their days gossiping and putting on makeup and putting on jewelry. In another tribe, she found that the men and women were equal warriors. So what the women would do is go hunt alongside the men and go attack other tribes alongside men. And in the third tribe, she illustrates that they were actually both peaceful kind of caretakers and nurturing. So what she really illustrated is how gender really varies across cultural differences. Earlier in this slide, I mentioned that gender is not necessarily related to sex, but there is some connections. Historically, a lot of social scientists used to think that gender is completely socially constructed, meaning that we are all born tabula rasa, or blank slates, and we learn our gender from birth on. And there was a historical story, or a famous study that was done in the Johns Hopkins Medical School by a psychiatrist that was a proponent of this school of thought. And he thought that we were born with no gender identity. We learn all of our quote unquote masculine and feminine behavioral cues. and actions, and therefore we can kind of like erase and start over. The story of David Reimer really illustrates, number one, how scientists actually believed this in the 1970s, and number two, how they were terribly wrong. So actually, I can send you the video link to the story of David Reimer if you're interested. But just to kind of give you a short summary, David Reimer was born as a twin, as a boy. And when he was born and his parents decided to um, circumcise both of the twin boys. What ended up happening is that David Reimer's foreskin was burnt off because the hospital used lasers to circumcise instead of knives, and the laser malfunctioned and his foreskin was burned off, and his penis was burned off, excuse me. So basically, the family took David Reimer to Johns Hopkins Medical University, and the physician decided that, since we can just learn gender, he could turn, and his name at that point was Bruce Reimer into Brenda Reimer. So they worked with cognitive behavioral therapy, and they tried to turn Bruce into Brenda, and it seemed to work for a while, and the physician actually um, published a ton of work and gained a lot of notoriety in the 1970s. And eventually, when puberty hit, this is when Brenda Reimer had this huge identity crisis, and then ended up having depression, and then later in life changed her name to David Reimer, transitioned back to being a male, married a woman with children, and then ended up committing suicide at age 38. So this tragic story really illustrates that in as much as gender is socially constructed, there is certainly some link between biology and behavior. Maybe it's our hormone levels, maybe it's our interaction with the world. We don't know how strong that connection is, but we do have to know that there is some connection there. But social scientists are not biologists, we're not medical doctors, so our concern is more with the societal expectations around gender, and more importantly, the social inequalities around sex and gender. So to get us started thinking about how society affects us and these social influences impact our behaviors, I want to talk a little bit about what we call doing gender. So when social scientists talk about doing gender, we're talking about how we learn what it means to be male and what it means to be female, how we learn what it means to be masculine versus feminine. And we learn this from a wide variety of places. So gender role socialization typically starts in the family. So there have been quite a few studies that examine gender role socialization within the family. Kara Smith in 2005 actually did a study on how pregnant women talk to their bellies. And she had this really interesting finding that when women who were pregnant talked to their bellies, they actually interacted with their own unborn child differently based on the sex of the infant or the baby in the belly, I guess. And what she found is that mothers would refer to their unborn children as, like studs and heroes, and they were super strong, and they would say like, oh, look at my little fella kicking really hard and strong, like the boy he is. And then they would actually be a lot more gentle and coddling with their female babies. And so what this really illustrates is even before we're born, we're genderized. We learn gender, or we're, put into this box of what it means to be male versus female. Other research shows that infants play or are taught to play differently based on their gender. You can think about the colors of toys, the way that we dressed infants, the types of toys we introduced to them. And then you can think about childhood toys. Think about the toys that you were given as a child and how different it may have been based on your siblings if they were of opposite gender. And also modeling behavior. We often model what it means to be a boy versus what it means to be a girl within our families. And the image, as you can see on the slide, is a little boy playing with soldiers. And oftentimes these are the types of toys that boys are given, and that teaches boys like this is a boy's role, as opposed to a girl is often given like a Barbie doll or a baby doll or a house. We also know in research that in our education system, we have teachers who believe in gender stereotypes, and teachers typically believe in these stereotypes. The education system also gender socializes us. So what researchers have noticed is that sometimes teachers will direct preschoolers and kindergartners and elementary school kids to different types of play, where girls are encouraged to do more indoor activities, while boys are encouraged to be more active and outdoors. Sadker and Sadker had a landmark study in the 1990s where they studied classroom roles and gender. And what Sadker and Sadker found is that teachers actually interact with their students differently based on the gender of the child. And what they found is that boys were encouraged to speak out of turn, not pushed to raise their hands, while girls were often silenced and told like, oh no, you have to raise your hand if you want to speak. And boys were not nearly as disciplined as much as girls were in the classroom. And what they argue is that even though boys and girls are sitting side by side in the same classroom, they're actually receiving a completely different education. There are other places we learn gender and how to be a boy versus a girl. Peer groups are typically how we start spending our time in childhood. And if you are playing with friends who do very stereotypical girl or boy activities, this is what you see and come to expect as normal. Religion often plays a role in determining what we see as acceptable or moral within our gender roles, and as does the media. So if you think about all of the Disney princesses historically, the storyline is virtually the same. These young women who are princesses are in distress and they need a man to save them, and that story has been circulated over and over, which often tells young girls this is what your role is as a young girl. So before we delve into our discussion on gender inequality, I wanted to just raise a few key terms or define a few key terms around our discussion. So I'm sure many of you have heard these terms being thrown around, but just to kind of clarify for those of you who might be a little confused or haven't heard these terms before, to start with, we have the term patriarchy. And patriarchy literally translates to the rule of father. And essentially, when sociologists talk about patriarchy, we're talking about a system in society where men hold power while women are excluded from that power. And it's pretty closely related to misogyny, which is the dislike or contempt or prejudice against women. And both patriarchy and misogyny tends to be related to sexism, because sexism is essentially the prejudice or discrimination on the basis of sex. While both men and women can be victims of sexism, typically, if you look at the data and the historical patterns we have in our society, women have been victims of sexism far more than men. And finally, we have institutionalized sexism, which is where our institutions are organized by sexist practices. So sexism could be individual acts, right? So you can say, well, my boss is really sexist because he prefers to hire men over women, or prefers women to take on certain roles versus men to take on certain roles. But when we're talking about institutionalized sexism, we're talking about sexism that's embedded into our everyday practices, into our everyday institutions. So these are the key terms, and now we're moving on to talking a little bit about different forms of gender inequality. To start, we could talk about the gender inequality we experience in our homes. And this is what we call the gender factory, because the gender factory is where we not only learn patterns of gender inequality, but also practice it in our everyday lives. So I know earlier in our book we talked about the second shift a little bit, and remember the second shift is where women go to work full time and then have that pattern of coming home and doing the vast lion's share of housework and childcare. Um, So as you can see from this data illustrates the number of minutes per day spent on household tasks by gender. And you can see where women are spending a lot more time than men on food and drink preparation, cleaning, laundry, household management, which is typically like paying the bills, kitchen and food cleanup. And then if you look at where men are spending the bulk of their time, they're doing things like lawn, garden, and houseplants and other household activities, and maintenance and repairs around the house. So again, you see this very traditional divide between what men are doing around the house and what women are doing around the house. And the reason sociologists point out that a lot of this is unequal is because if you break it down by time, women by far spending more time than men on a lot of these tasks, roughly double the amount of time. And on top of that, the tasks that women do tend to be a lot more necessary and regular. So if you think about having to cook dinner and clean up and dinner and do laundry, these happen very, very regularly, as opposed to mowing the lawn that happens maybe once every couple of weeks. So men's tasks typically tend to be. So when it comes to the education system, we have gender inequality, but it's not quite what you would think. Going back to Soccer and Sotker study, you did see that boys and girls are treated differently in the classroom. But I believe the irony in that is that it's actually helping women propel in education or succeed in school, while it's actually hurting boys in the long run. So as you can see by these two data points, on the one hand, you have the dropout rates, and the red line represents girls and the blue line represents boys. And as you can see, girls have been dropping out less than men ever since the 1970s, right? So it's been a very persistent pattern. And then if you take a look at this next chart, which refers to the college completion rates by gender, you can see that girls are outpacing men drastically. So since the 1990s, women have surpassed men in college completion rates, and are doing drastically better than men in college and finishing college. And I think a lot of that is related to the expectations around masculinity, where men are expected to go be the breadwinners and financially support their families, and therefore have to drop out of school or drop out of college to go take on a job to help support their families. As opposed to women are often seen as, you can go to school and further your education. It might also be tied to the job market, where men's jobs don't necessarily require a college degree. So if you think about like stereotypically masculine positions like construction or plumbing, um, or household repairs, you don't necessarily need a college degree for these types of jobs, and yet you could still make a livable wage, as opposed to female type jobs. They don't pay nearly as well as these typically male jobs, and therefore women feel the pressure to have to go and continue their education. So not only are women surpassing men in college completion rates, but women are really surpassing men in terms of advanced degrees. And this is a trend that started in the 1990s and has been continuing on. So again, the blue line represents men and the red line represents women. And as you can see, both men and women have been increasing the number of advanced degrees. And advanced degrees basically refers to anything after your bachelor. So this could be a master's degree, a PhD, a medical degree, a law degree. But what you really want to take note of is this gap, right? So we call this the education gap between men and women. And as you can see, in the early 1990s, not nearly as many women earned advanced degrees as men, but somewhere in the mid-1990s, women start to surpass men, and then this gap just kept growing and growing and growing, where men are, they've kind of lagged a little bit behind women. And the question, of course, is why is this the case? So moving on, we're going to take a look at different forms of gender inequality in the workplace, and we're going to talk a little bit about each of these in greater depth. So we're going to talk about the wage gap, occupational segregation, the glass ceiling effect, sexual harassment, and paid and maternity and paid paternity leave. So to get us started, I want to talk about the wage gap. And social scientists define the wage gap as the unequal pay between men and women. And if you imagine for every dollar, for every $1 the white male earns, a white woman earns about 79 cents to that dollar. What's really fascinating is when you aggregate the data between men and women, you see a stark difference in terms of the pay between men and women. So if you took a look at white men, for every $1 a white male makes, an Asian woman makes about 87 cents, a white woman makes about 79 cents. If you take a look at just mothers, they earn 71 cents to the dollar. So they experience what we call the motherhood penalty, which we'll talk a little bit more about. Black women earn 63 cents to the dollar. Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islanders earn 59 cents. Native American women earn 57 cents. And then Latino women are at the very bottom of the hierarchy where they earn just 54 cents per dollar a white male makes. So earlier I mentioned the motherhood penalty. So if you go back to this data point of moms overall earning 71 cents to the dollar, the motherhood penalty is a really interesting data point that a lot of social scientists pointed out that the moment a woman has a child, she has a very strong penalty where she loses wages. And some of this is obvious because it's like, okay, so you have a baby, of course you're gonna have to like scale back at work. So you're just not able to earn as much. But even when they aggregated the data and looked at professional women who are in high-ranking positions who don't necessarily scale back, they still experience a penalty within their wages. On the other hand, men experience what they call a fatherhood premium. And the fatherhood premium is a really interesting paradox to the motherhood penalty. Because you would think, okay, you're a new mother, you're a new father, you suddenly need more money because it's very expensive to raise a child. But the paradox is that women actually earn less and men actually get a premium for becoming a father. So researchers have noticed that when a man has a child, he suddenly, ironically, has a bump in his wages. So part of that may be that the men are just kind of working more hours because they recognize the need for more money, but some of that researchers have attributed to just plain old discrimination. So we talked about the wage gap. We're moving on to occupational segregation. And occupational segregation refers to the tendencies for certain jobs to be typed by or dominated by men and certain jobs to be dominated by women. So if you want to take a moment here, if you have your notebook, just jot down what you think are stereotypically male careers and stereotypically female careers. So maybe under male, you might put something like construction or engineer or architect. And under female, you might put something like nurse or secretary or childcare worker. And what is really problematic about occupational segregation is that what you find is that there's an enduring pattern when a job is dominated by women, it tends to have much lower pay and lower prestige. And when a job is dominated by men, it tends to have much higher prestige and much higher earnings. So if you take a look at this data from the BLS or the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the top chart illustrates the gender composition of the lowest paying occupations. So these are some of the lowest paid jobs in the United States. So if you have childcare workers, hosts and hostesses, personal care aides, cashiers, fast food and counter workers, laundry workers, and food preparation. And as you can see, here the blue lines represent women. The vast majority of these jobs are at least half, if not more, women. So if you take a look at childcare workers, 95% of them are women. Hosts and hostesses, 80% women. Personal care aides, 70 or 78-ish% women, and so on and so forth. Now take a look at the bottom chart, which are the gender composition of the highest paying occupations. So here we have architectural engineer managers, pilots, petroleum engineers, dentists, computer systems managers, chief executives, lawyers, and plus physicians and surgeons. And as you can see, it's the inverse of the above chart, where these jobs are incredibly dominated by men. So here you can see that more than 90% of architectural engineer managers are men, 90% of pilots are men, 87% of petroleum engineers are men, close to 80% of dentists are men, over 70% of computer systems managers are men, over 70% of chief executives are men. Roughly 70% are lawyers, of lawyers are men, and then, just over 50%, or I'm sorry, 60% of physicians are men. So typically what you see is that male-dominated positions tend to be far more higher paying, and lower paying fields tend to be dominated by women. So we talked about the wage gap and we talked about occupational segregation. So now we're moving on to a term you probably have heard called the glass ceiling effect. And the glass ceiling effect is when women advanced in their careers but eventually hit what we call an invisible barrier that disables them from moving up to the highest ranks of their companies. So on May 16, 2019, Fortune magazine published an article touting that there was a huge breakthrough in corporate America, that the CEOs of Fortune 500 companies had their highest number of female CEOs in history. Any guesses what that percentage was? If you guessed around 5%, you're correct. So for the first time in history, we had this huge breakthrough where 6.6% of CEOs of Fortune 500 companies were women. So basically what that means is that 93.4% of the CEOs are still men. And this is essentially how the glass ceiling effect typically looks. So what you find is that at the entry level, you have rough parity. You have roughly 50-50 representation of men and women. But as you go through the pipes, as you advance in your career, you go from entry level to manager, then senior manager to director, then vice president to senior vice president to the C-suite, which are people like chief executive operators, chief institutional operator, chief financial operator. So these are the people at the very top. That representation of women just diminishes over time. And what's really fascinating is you see this pretty much in all fields. So if you look at academia, roughly the same number of women and men start as entry-level professors. But as they advance through tenureship, which is going through the promotional ranks of academia, women do not get tenure nearly as much as men. If you look at the law field or the legal field, roughly the same number of men and women enter as entry-level attorneys, but very few women actually make partners of their firm. Some researchers have noted what they call the glass escalator effect, where discrimination against women enable men to advance much more quickly through what they call a glass escalator to the top ranks of their position or their companies. So in addition to the wage gap, occupational segregation, and the glass ceiling effect, there is also what we call sexual harassment. And I'm sure many of you have heard of sexual harassment. And sexual harassment essentially can include any act of sexual assault, unwanted touching or physical contact, requests for sexual favors, making employments or promotions dependent on sexual favors, exposure to sexual acts, whether it be your employer or your boss is exposing you to some pornography or doing something lewd in front of you, verbal harassment, which can be jokes and inappropriate stories. And the vast majority of people who are victims of sexual harassment are women. So there was a recent study conducted by the ABC News and the Washington Post, and what they found is that 54% of women who were interviewed actually reported some unwanted sexual advance in the workplace. What's really fascinating about this data point is that um, oftentimes men thinks that sexual harassment goes punished, so that people who are harassers or perpetrators of sexual harassment, they get what they deserve. So 56% of men believe that, 44% of men believe that workplace harassment goes unpunished. But what the research actually found that only 5% of men who are perpetrators of sexual harassment do go punished. So 95% of them go unpunished. And I think the question is, of course, why is it that there's this huge disparity in first what is being reported and what is actually happening, as I'm sure that many of you have experienced sexual harassment but never reported it. And second, why is it that there aren't more punishments in place for these um, sexual harassment acts or acts of sexual harassment? The final form of sexual gender inequality at work is paid maternity and paternity leave in the US. And paid maternity and paternity leave basically refers to the fact that different countries have different expectations or policies around maternity and paid leave. So the USA actually has no federal mandates on maternity or paternity leave, and the only act we actually have in the US is the Family Medical Leave Act, which was passed in 1993. And the FMLA basically says that you are granted 12 weeks of unpaid leave, and you must be guaranteed your job when you return. So what this means is that your employer gets to decide whether or not you get paid leave or not. So if you have a great employer, like let's say, some companies have like 12 weeks of paid leave, full benefits, while other companies say, yeah, you can take the leave, but I'm not going to pay you. And this is really a stark contrast to the rest of the world. So if you take a look at this map, what this really illustrates is that the US actually has no federally mandated maternity or paid leave, while other countries offer up to 52 weeks of paid leave. So can you imagine living in a country where you can have a child and take a year off of fully paid, and this applies to mothers and fathers. That is way better for social stability, and it's better for families, right? Because they're able to actually support their children and be there for their children and not have to be in economic crisis if they have a child. So I want to also share this chart with you that illustrates some of the different data points from around the world. So the USA, 0 weeks of maternity or paternity leave. And if you take a look at the United Kingdom, they do 40 weeks. Vietnam does 26 weeks. Ireland does 26 weeks. Singapore does 16 weeks. Canada does 15 weeks. Bangladesh does 16 weeks. China does 14 weeks. Chad or HOD does 14 weeks. The Congo does 14 weeks. Mexico does 12 weeks, and Iran does 12 weeks. You can see where we stand in terms of the rest of the world. And the question, of course, is how does this hurt or harm or help people? How does this help families? How does this help children in the world? So the last form of inequality in our institutional system is the criminal justice system. So I brought this data to illustrate the gender divide in offenders. And as you can see, the type of violent crimes are listed on the x-axis. So we have assault, robbery, rape, and then we have threatened or completed act. And then here we have the percentage who are male and percentage who are female. And as you can see, overwhelmingly, men tend to be perpetrators of crime. And the question is, why is this the case? Interestingly enough, women are actually on the rise. So if you look at the percentage of women represented in all of these crimes over time, it actually tends to increase over time. But the question is, of course, why is it that men are so heavily represented here? And I think a lot of social scientists would point to the ways that men and women are socialized very differently in childhood. And also the pressures on a lot of men to perhaps be economic providers or to have their status tied around their economic success. Um, so just something for you to think about and reflect on over the next couple of days. So we're doing a quick gear shift. We're moving on from the inequalities around sex and gender, and we're going to take a look at gender identity and sexual orientation in the next few slides. So a lot of times we typically confuse terms when it comes to issues of gender identity and sexual orientation. We often hear things like, what does it mean to be cisgender? What does it mean to be cis man? What does it mean to be androgynous or, intersex? What does it mean to be pansexual or bisexual? So this chart, I think, really does a nice job of illustrating the different kind of key terms around gender identity and sexual orientation. So gender identity is how we identify, or the way we label ourselves or name ourselves. What it means to be a cis woman is that your sexual biological parts, remember your primary sex characteristics and your secondary sex characteristics, corresponds with how you feel. So if you are born with a vagina, a uterus, breasts, an hourglass shape, then you are probably, and you feel like you are a feminine woman, then you're cisgender. And the same goes for cis men, right? So men who are born with a penis and, testosterone and testicles and also identify as a straight male, they are what we call cisgender or cis male. People who fall in between are transgender or non-binary. So transgender individuals often feel that they are born in the wrong body. That even though on the outside they may look like a man physically, on the inside they feel like they are female. So, and the trans movement has gained a lot of traction in the last few years. So perhaps you know of like Laverne Cox and the Kardashian guy, I forgot his name, Bruce Jenner, who is now Caitlyn Jenner, right? So we often have these trans individuals that come out and really give some voice to a very small marginalized portion of our population. Gender expression refers to how we express our gender, so how we behave in accordance to societal expectations. So if you think about someone who's feminine, one of the biggest ways we express our gender is the way we dress. So typically a feminine cisgender woman will wear dresses and makeup and have long flowy hair and walk a certain way and speak a certain way, while on the other side you have cisgender men who may have more muscles because he spends time bulking up at the gym, and he may dress a certain way and use his deep voice. And then obviously we have people who fall in between, and we have people who are non-binary, who are people that don't necessarily conform to these gender expectations. They may one day be male and one day more female. So people who are non-binary are slowly coming out and speaking or telling us their narrative, and it's really fascinating. Biological sex, like we had talked about earlier in this lecture, it is male, female, and intersex. And then sexual orientation is who we're attracted to. So heterosexuality is basically being attracted to the opposite sex. Bisexuality is being attracted to both men and women. Pansexuality is being attracted to anyone regardless of their biological sex, gender expression, and gender identity. Homosexuals are attracted to people of the same sex, and asexuals have no sexual attraction to anyone. And sexuality is really fascinating. One of the most famous cases or research studies on sexual orientation was the Alfred Kinsey study. And Alfred Kinsey was a professor at the University of Indiana who started as a zoologist studying wasps. The bugs, not the people. And essentially what he did is he got interested in sexual behaviors of people and did a career switch and started studying people's behaviors. He went around the country and surveyed hundreds of thousands of individuals on their sexual identity, their sexual behavior, and their sexual attraction. And essentially what he argued is that there's no such thing or it's very rare for people to be completely heterosexual or completely homosexual. And he created what he calls the Kinsey scale. And what the Kinsey scale does is it's a scale from 0 to 6, where a score of 0 means you're exclusively heterosexual, so you've never had any attraction to someone of the same sex. You haven't even fantasized about it at all. And then on the other hand, you have someone who's exclusively homosexual with a score of 6, and this is someone who from birth has always been homosexual, has never been attracted to someone of the opposite sex. And essentially what Kinsey argues is that the vast majority of the people in our population follow a bell curve, where if you can imagine a bell curve on this chart, it would be where most people fall here, somewhere between 1 and 5. There are plenty of issues within the LGBTQIA plus community. Perhaps one of the biggest issues that we have is homophobia and its cousin transphobia, where people are not comfortable around people who are gender nonconforming or bisexual or homosexual. So homophobia refers to the fear or dislike and extreme hatred sometimes of people who are non-conforming or non-cisgender, I should say, or heterosexual or not heterosexual. Historically, in the United States, we had what we call conversion camps, where churches attempted to convert gays and lesbians into heterosexual adults. And they did practices that were really not empirically supported. So they would, cry in each other's arms, um, do shock therapy. So men were often hooked to like shock therapy machines, and then were shown homosexual pornography. And then if they were attracted or they experienced a sexual arousal, they were shocked to kind of like shock it out of them. These conversion camps actually had an extremely low success rate. I believe it was like less than 2% of people actually came out of them saying, yes, I'm cured. And therefore, they've been actually shut down. And in the state of California, it's now not legal to have a conversion camp. And the other experience that a lot of trans and homosexuals and bisexuals experience are hate crimes. So in the last FBI crime report, they aggregate the data by looking at hate crimes, and what they found is that 20% of all of the hate crimes were based on one's sexual orientation or gender identity. So obviously this leads us to a lot of the movements that have happened to gain more awareness of the gender inequalities out there, but also the kind of ways to solve a lot of these movements. There have been quite a few social movements around sex, gender, sexuality, and sexual orientation. I'm sure many of you have read about or have been part of the hashtag #MeToo or hashtag Time's Up, and this was a movement that started a few years ago to bring awareness of all of the sexual assault that women experience. And part of this was a product of the Christine Blasey Ford testimony a couple years ago. The other big thing that has kind of come out in recent years is intersectional feminism. So a lot of first and second wave feminists tend to be dominated by the conversations of white privileged women, and intersectional feminism has been a movement to kind of include the stories of women who don't necessarily fit that profile. So poor Black lesbian women, Latina working class women, Asian women, have all kind of wanted to be part of this conversation, and this has been given birth to the intersectional feminist movement. A lot of people have been talking about problems with hegemonic masculinity, and hegemonic masculinity is this idea that there is this incredible social pressure to be masculine, and what it means to be masculine is extremely limiting in this country, or culture, I should say. And the expectations for masculinity typically tends to be like, don't show your feelings, don't cry, just if you fall and get hurt, just rub it off, and don't be vulnerable. And it's okay to be a sexual predator, and it's okay to have sex with as many women or men as you want. And Your worth is determined by how successful you are economically. And a lot of people have really criticized hegemonic masculinity because it's very limiting for men. So they call this the crisis of masculinity, right? This problem that because of these cultural pressures for men to conform to these unrealistic expectations, it's actually causing extremely high rates of depression among men, and it's actually causing more social problems. On the other hand, you have men who say that the problem in our society is that men are becoming too feminine. So the men's rights movements and the fathers' rights movement have emerged over the last decade. And the men's rights movement says that feminism is actually problematic and it creates more problems for men. And the fathers' rights movement say that feminism not only is problematic to our society, but also men lose their rights as fathers due to kind of these feminist movements. So you can see that there's a lot of buzz around issues of gender, sexuality, and sexual orientation, and people have kind of been speaking up from both sides. It's a very controversial issue, or I should say there's a lot of controversial issues around topics of sex and gender. So one of the biggest kind of things I wanted to talk about is how a movement can really yield social change. So I wanted to give a little bit of a highlight to the marriage equality movement in the United States. And it's funny because in 2020, we kind of take it for granted that gays and lesbians have the right to get married because, it was 5 years ago when Obergefell versus Hodges happened, legalizing same-sex marriage in the U.S. But this is a movement that lasted a really long time. It dates back into the in some ways into the early 1900s, but as a movement, it really gained traction in the 1970s with the Baker-McConnell case. So Jack Baker and James McConnell were students who wanted to get married. And basically the court said, no, you can't. So they fought it and they were denied over and over again. But what the power of this case did is it actually gave their experience a voice to shed light to the country that other people out there exist that may not be straight but also want to get married. And their case really kind of paved the way for the movement to, start and then gain traction and then lead to 2015. So we're talking about 50 years ago. So this movement is not necessarily this like new issue that just popped out of nowhere. In 1984, Berkeley offered domestic partnerships for its city residents. And then it took like almost a decade for a state to legalize same-sex marriage in 1993. And when Clinton was in office, he tried to overturn this state-by-state initiative to legalize same-sex marriage by signing the Defense of Marriage Act. And what the DOMA did, and DOMA is Defense of Marriage Act, what DOMA did is it basically said, look, you may be recognized in Hawaii that you are a same-sex couple and you're married, but at the federal level, you will never receive or be entitled to the benefits that other heterosexual couples get once they're married. So what it did is it basically banned same-sex marriages at the federal level, no matter what the states were doing. Interestingly enough, regardless of Clinton's signing of the Defense of Marriage Act, you saw a state-by-state legalization of same-sex marriage from 1996 to 2015. So this was a nearly 20-year state-by-state battle that kind of culminated in this large landmark case in 2015 that led to the legalization of same-sex marriage in the United States. And what's fascinating is that people's minds have also changed. So what this chart illustrates is the number or percentage of Americans who either oppose or favor same-sex marriage. So the green line represents people who favor it, and the red line represents people who oppose it. And as you can see, over the last almost 20 years, the number of people who actually oppose same-sex marriage has been declining, while the number of people who approve of it or favor it has been increasing. So this really illustrates a huge shift in our society, but also the power of social movements and the power of what groups of people can do to inspire social change. So that concludes my lecture for today, and hopefully you enjoyed this and learned a lot. I will see you in the class.